Well, thank you so much, Guillermo. Really happy to be here. Really pleased for the invitation. Very excited to talk to you all, and especially for the debate and the discussion part at the end of my presentation, where I can really hear from you all and see you know the questions you have, and we can really get into the details about our work and our historical perspective and what that means for navigating our polycrisis today, and especially as young people. How can we all do this together? What can we learn from the past? Which is really what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. Hopefully you can all see this. Send me a ping if not. It looks like it's working. Um, yeah, so very excited to be here. As I said, as Guillermo mentioned, I'm the founder and director of Societal Dynamics, or SODI, along with many other affiliations that he noted. And really what we are trying to do, and we'll talk more about this, is understand history as much as we can, explore different periods of history, different crises, how they have unfolded in the past. And what Sodai in particular tries to do is then learn those lessons. What does understanding the past do to help us in the present navigate towards a better future? This is really our mission. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. And really, I want to keep my remarks as brief as possible. I'll probably end up being fairly long-winded because I'm an academic and we like to hear ourselves talk. I'm going to try to keep it brief because I do want to have a lot of time for the discussion with everybody. And I'm not going to be talking about any particular I'm not going to be talking about any particular study or any particular article. I really want to give a sort of higher level view of our work in the past few years, exploring a few different themes. In particular, just what is polycrisis? How do we understand it? How do sort of people in my field think about the term these days? And then bringing the historical perspective into it. Think about, well, is is this unique? How different is the modern world from what has happened in the past? What are the ways that it is different? What are the ways that it is the same? And then what can we learn from that, right? How have different periods of crisis, different entanglement played out before polycrisis-like sort of periods? What lessons can we learn? What lessons can we draw from this historical perspective in helping us explain where we are today and also help navigate to a better future? And then really at the end, the main point of all of this is, okay, what does it mean to be a young person in this very tumultuous period right now? What is the role of youth in our current polycrisis moment? And hopefully that will then lead very directly into a detailed discussion with everybody. So to begin with, let's just talk about what polycrisis is, what does it mean, and how does it sort of different than other terms and concepts that have been used more traditionally in fields like disaster management, conflict resolution, etc. So I think we're all on the same page. We all acknowledge that we are in an age of polycrisis right now. But it's still unclear, even though the concept and the term is becoming popular, not everybody agrees on what it means. Not everybody is very clear about what exactly it means. It's also unclear. Some people say that it is entirely unprecedented. You hear this in the news a lot. Oh, we're in unique times. We're in unprecedented times. Is that true? As an historian, I always want to question those sorts of statements and explore, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And really the key question is, well, how does the concept, however you define it, does it actually help us in any way address or understand our pressing challenges? Can't we just use some of the other concepts that exist? Cascading risk, acute recurring disasters. There's a bunch of different other terms that have already been used for decades. What does polycrisis add to it? So let me break this down a little bit, and this is how I and my colleagues understand the term polycrisis. First of all, you have to really understand what crisis means. And I think there's a lot of not quite misinformation, but maybe confusion about what exactly a crisis is, even among scholars. Really, a crisis is about high and growing risk, right? People often say the word crisis and they mean the actual event or the outcome from that crisis, the disaster, the humanitarian relief that is needed, people suffering, property damaged. That's the outcome. That's the manifestation of crisis. Crisis itself is the risk that something bad will or is likely to happen. In turn, risk is really a function of the causal drivers that create that risk, the exposure of any given system to that risk, and the vulnerability of that system to those causal drivers. A key thing, and we're going to come back to this a lot during my talk, when we talk about causal factors, there's two different forces at play. There's the long-term pressures, which we call stresses. These are things that build up over a long period of time. You don't always notice them while they're happening, but they set the stage for increasing risk. Then there's the trigger, which is the more acute or short-term immediate thing that happens. This is a constrained event. It's usually a short term, it's usually fairly localized, but it interacts with the longer term stress. And together, these things produce risk. So to give a simple example, just to explain what we're talking about, think of what we might call a monocrisis, right? This is a crisis in only one system. It's very localized. It doesn't spread. It's just one thing that's under risk. Think of, for example, a bridge, one bridge in one town when there's a hurricane approaching. That bridge might be facing a crisis, right? You can think of that bridge as a system. It's a system of concrete, of wire, of metal that is designed to allow transportation over a body of water. That's what a bridge is. It's a transport system. That system could be facing a crisis, meaning it is facing risk. So in this case, the risk could be there's stress. So there's wear and tear on the bridge over years. The concrete is starting to crack. The metal wires are starting to wear thin, whatever it is. That's a long-term stress. The trigger is, of course, the hurricane itself, the high force winds that happen in a hurricane. The exposure is whether or not that bridge is in the path of the hurricane, right? You could have stress and a trigger, but if it's not exposed to it, then it doesn't matter, right? It's not facing risk. The vulnerability comes in because concrete happens to break, wires happen to bust at high tension. So it's a little bit different than exposure. So this means that if a bridge is wearing down, it's in the path of a hurricane, it means that if the hurricane presents very high winds, that bridge is vulnerable. It is likely to collapse or to crack, right? So we would say that this bridge is at high risk. It's facing a crisis. Now imagine that, but in dozens of different systems that have global reach and that all interact with each other. That's really what a polycrisis is. I'm not going to read this long, difficult definition. This is a definition that me and my colleagues came up with recently. You can see at the bottom here. This is a paper that we are about to publish. This is where this definition is drawn from. I should also say I'm very happy to share these slides with anyone who wants them. If you want to review them, it has a few citations to some of our relevant literature. Basically, what this is saying, and this is a sort of growing consensus in the field, that polycrisis is when many different systems are facing this kind of high risk. These are environmental systems, these are ecological, economic, political, social, cultural, so many different systems at once. These are systems that have global reach, like our global economy is literally a global system. We're facing long-term stress from climate change, from environmental degradation, biophysical damage. Economic dysfunction is a long-term stress. We're facing a lot of triggering events, right? Floods, hurricanes, tsunamis, droughts, ecological shocks, warfare, and economic depression. These are all triggering events that interact with the long-term stresses. And because there's so many systems involved, and because they have global reach, nearly everybody on the planet is exposed to these risks, and we are vulnerable to them. Our social systems, our political systems, our institutions, our cultures are vulnerable and exposed. So this is why we say that we are in a state of heightened and growing risk across many different systems all at once. That's a polycrisis. That's really what we mean. And when I think about it, I like to think about crisis as a spectrum, right? So it's not like there's a clear definition between what's a single crisis versus a polycrisis. It's a little more fluid than that. And again, this is from a forthcoming article that we have. You can think of on one hand, on this left-hand side, this is again localized, constrained, a single crisis, like a bridge in a hurricane under crisis. Moving a little bit towards the right, you can have something that's still localized, but maybe involves multiple different systems. Think of a housing bubble in one large city, right? There's a housing crisis. This is a social issue. It's a welfare issue, and it's also an economic issue. But it's probably maybe little localized, or at least it's potentially constrained to just that city. You move a little further to the right, now you have multi-systems, many different systems under crisis at once, involving many different regions, and these systems are interlinked. We call them causally entangled. This means that if there's a dysfunction in one system, it's going to impact another system. So let's say, for example, there's economic inequality. The economic system is not functioning properly. This means that people's health is poor, people are suffering. That makes them more vulnerable to things like disease. So the economic dysfunction creates a health crisis. When that health crisis happens, maybe that creates a political dysfunction, right? So one issue, one crisis in one system causes a crisis in another system. That's an indication that you're in a polycrisis type of environment. This picture here is drawn from the medieval Black Death bubonic plague. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. That's an example of this kind of entangled multi-system sort of crisis. And then again, at the sort of far extreme, we have what I would call our modern polycrisis world, where we all know that these systems and these crises are growing, they are entangled, and now for the first time, they have global reach, truly global reach. And this is really an important distinction. This does actually add something that other terms don't quite capture about our current world. The traditional way of understanding a disaster, a shock, is to think about it like this on the left-hand side. You have your social systems, you have some level of capacity, whatever that means. It kind of hums along, and then all of a sudden there's a shock. There's a trigger event, a flood, a hurricane, a drought, whatever it happens to be. That creates some dysfunction, you lose capacity, but then you work on it, right? You respond to it and you grow back, and now you're at the level you were before. That's recovery. That's the traditional mindset of disaster response and recovery. Even today, even still, a lot of agencies in the UN, the Red Cross, still have this in their mindset. That's starting to change, but it's been slow. It's hard to break free of this traditional sort of way of working and way of understanding. In a polycrisis, you never really recover to your former state. And you have to think about it in terms of not only the trigger, but the longer term stresses that are involved. Because even before the shock happens, you can be losing capacity because of these stresses that are building up. So then the shock happens and you lose an even more capacity. You try to respond, you try to recover, but because of the capacity loss, you can't get back to where you were before, right? You don't recover to the same level. And if you don't take care of the stresses along the way, you're going to keep losing more and more capacity, then another shock is going to happen. And in a polycrisis, this is what is happening, right? It's the stresses that keep building that we're not dealing with, and those stresses are creating more frequent, more severe triggering events. So we're just losing capacity and we are yet to recover to previous levels. We just can't get back to where we were. We just don't have it in us. And this is really that vicious cycle that we're caught in today. And that's what really characterizes a polycrisis. So this is kind of how me and my colleagues understand what this means, where we are today. But then we try to, take a step back and take a larger view and say, well, people talk about this as a unique moment in world history. Is it though? This is an empirical question. Are there periods in the past that at least resemble those of us today? And if so, can we learn something from them? I'll give you a spoiler alert. My answer is yes, and I'll explain why exactly that is. First of all, though, let me just stress that there absolutely are some very important things that are completely unique about our modern age, right? It's not everything has historical precedent. The fact that we are interconnected as deeply as we are, and so many of our systems are interconnected with each other, that has never been as deep as it is today. The fact that that interconnection happens on a truly global scale, which means that different shocks are more synchronous across more places than ever before, that's unique. It's always been interregional. There's always been large scale interconnections, but never truly global. The main difference is that we are now facing permanent and irrecoverable climate and environmental devastation from anthropogenic climate change. There has always been climate and environmental fluctuations, but we've always been able to sort of recover back to our baseline. Now we're facing permanent climate devastation, which means the prospect of never-ending long-term stresses, right? If the environmental degradation is placing stress, this might mean that will never go away. That's unique. That's very scary. I'll let us sit with that for a second. But there are some things we can do. And there are some ways that many of the sort of specific issues and crises we're facing actually are pretty old. These are things that humans have faced many, many times in the past, and we are still here, right? This is good news. This I take some hope from. We have been able to navigate and to recover from these things. Wars, common throughout human history. Economic turmoil, high inequality, the kind of political factionism, xenophobia, nationalism, a lot of the things that we're facing today, very, very common in all parts of the world in the past. We've also seen, again, environmental change, environmental different regimes are very common historically, and these have led to very acute ecological disasters, and they actually don't look that different than today. Famine, drought, major pandemics, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, different unstable climate regimes. Very, very common. Humans have had to learn to deal with these in the past. There are lessons there. And again, just the fact of having different systems that are causally entangled with each other, never globally, but across different regions, like on a continental scale, that is very common. That has happened before. So when people say, is it unique? I say, well, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. And there's some important things about lessons from this, right? The scary part is what we learn is that every society that has ever existed has ceased to exist, except for the ones we currently occupy, right? This is the lesson of history. These crises have been devastating, right? Many, many societies have collapsed, have disappeared from the map, cultures are gone. That is the norm, right? It's only the ones we currently occupy that still exist. Maybe it's just we haven't had our turn at collapse yet. That's a scary thought. That's what history suggests. But the more positive take, this is what I like to lean into, is that at the same time, we can learn from our past experiences. We are not forced to repeat past mistakes. We can learn. We can do better if we look to it, if we understand what has happened. I don't want to just say this is, this is not idle speculation. This is really at the core of my work. As Guillermo mentioned, I work with the SESHAT data bank Our project tries to gather data on hundreds of different societies from the past, deep, deep, deep past, thousands of years ago up to the present. We look at different patterns, we look at deviations and how societies have functioned. We try to test theories with explicit causal models. We combine quantitative and qualitative methods. Look at how societies have faced crises. Have they faced them well? Have they faced them poorly? And then at SODI, our job is to take all that learning, take that historical knowledge, and turn it into policy relevant insights. How can we translate the lessons of history into helping us in the world today? This is really at the core of our work and what I want to be able to discuss with all of you today. Okay, so let me just give a few examples of what our historical research has suggested about how crises play out in the past. So I'm going to give you just three really, really quick examples just to help explain what we find, and then I'm going to kind of sum that up. So the first example comes from the Qing Dynasty, China. This is from a recent paper that myself and my colleagues published on this. This is the last big imperial powerful dynasty in China, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Large, complex, very productive, highly developed, highly advanced country at the time. Probably the most powerful, most productive country in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it also faced a number of crises. It was kind of a polycrisis type of environment, at least locally. There was climate variability, there was ecological threats, there was external threats and warfare, there was a lot of internal unrest and inequality. It faced a lot of these things. And one of the really interesting things that we find, again, this is a long-lasting dynasty. It's several centuries. What we find is that, again, because there is it's a poor environmental, unstable environment that they're facing. This led to major ecological triggering events throughout the reign, right? Throughout all of this time. Major floods, major droughts, weird flash frosts, like rivers were freezing over that had never frozen before. Locust swarms were common. There's just a lot of bad stuff that really affected food supply in particular. And that happened throughout its entire reign. And what we find, and this is the crucial bit of our historical analysis, early on, the Qing were able to manage these shocks pretty well. They were large, they were really well organized political system. They established granaries all throughout the country. So basically, whenever one of these shocks hit, they knew they were coming. So they would stockpile grain, stockpile food. They would give it out for free to all the people in different villages who were facing food insecurity. So people suffered, but it was managed. It wasn't as devastating as it could have been because they had this system in place. Over time, what we find is that inequality starts to grow. This creates more and more pressure because there's large-scale impoverishment. And it also, what happens is there ends up being a lot of corruption that seeps in. Too many people get too much wealth and too much power. Then there's a lot of people who are sort of trying to enter into the top classes, into the elite class, to become bureaucrats or officials in the Qing administration, which was sort of the best kind of job you could get at the time. There just weren't that many spots for them. So a lot of people got really frustrated. Again, corruption was really widespread. There was a lot of frustration. There's a lot of anger and resentment. So now in the second half of the dynasty, the same ecological shocks are happening. There's droughts, there's floods, but now the granary system doesn't work anymore. The officials that were supposed to be taking charge of it, they're corrupt, they're not working very hard, they're angry at the government, so they're just not doing their jobs. So now there's a flood or a drought, people are starving, they're relying and expecting on the granaries to give them food, they're empty. It doesn't work. So you find this increasingly social unrest. You start to see some violence, some revolt, some rebellions. Ultimately, it leads to the Taiping Rebellion, which historians still consider the bloodiest civil war in human history. And this is just a little artistic representation of the Taiping Rebellion. So he major, huge, devastating civil war, which you could see coming. It was built up from all of this inequality, all of this social dysfunction that then was interacting with or coupled with this environmental dysfunction. And so these two forces intertwined. And that is a, multi-systemic kind of crisis that manifest in this devastating civil war. That's one example. Let me give you another example from a different part of the world. This is a little more of a positive example, a little bit. This is Mesoamerica, and specifically the major capital of Monte Alban, this in the what is currently Mexico. So in the late first millennium CE, there was mega drought throughout the entire region. These are centuries of really dry, devastatingly dry conditions, really ruined farming for decades, centuries. This is credited, this drought, with the collapse of many great civilizations, the classic period Maya, Teotihuacan, major centers like Monte Alban, many others. You'll read this in a lot of the work on collapse like Jared Diamond, Joseph Tainter, Niall Ferguson. These mega drought, the collapse of the classic period Maya in this period, are one of the main examples of climate-led collapse that scholars point to today. But it wasn't just collapse, and this is what I think a lot of scholarship misses the point. Yes, there was collapse and devastation. There was also adaptation, resilience. People found a way to recover, to survive. There is a major lesson in this as well. So just again, to give a very brief explanation, all of this major drought led to significant depopulation. It was a huge city, one of the largest, most powerful in the region in earlier times. Around 1000 CE, it's basically abandoned. And again, the traditional explanation is there was drought, widespread famine, which led people to sort of be unrest, revolt against the rulers, large-scale violence, civil violence. There's a lot of archaeological signs of fighting in the area. Then you see the city basically depopulated. There's no more signs of occupation. And that's true. That's definitely happened. But it's a more complicated story than a lot of people acknowledge. First off, Monte Alban and archaeologists have started to put this together. They were experiencing violence and inequality even before the droughts kicked in, right? It wasn't just a static civilization. You could see the social systems breaking down. You could see the palaces, like the palaces where rulers lived, over time kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You could see more luxurious goods in the burials of elites, jewels, gold, really expensive wardrobes and things like that. The normal sort of regular people houses got smaller and smaller, more cramped. You could see this inequality, like literally in the layout of the city. You can see inequality growing over time. You can see signs of some violence, right? There's arrowheads, there's fires, there's images of things were happening even before the droughts. The other thing we find that archaeologists are trying to put together is while Monte Alban and these other centers are being depopulated, there's other smaller cities, especially in the Oaxaca Valley, are starting to grow. They're gaining in population. So what people are now starting to think is that it's not just that there was, catastrophic violence and everybody in Monte Alban died and killed each other. There was certainly a lot of violence, but a lot of people just left and re-established new cities elsewhere in the Oaxacan Valley, which was less exposed to the drought, right? So the crisis, the risk was less severe. And these people brought their traditions with them. They restored many traditional practices. The language persisted, a lot of the building styles, the religion we can see in the iconography in some of the statues. Their religion stayed the same, they brought it with them. But they also changed some things. Some of the political systems, some of the ways that rulers were organized, some of the public goods. we can see that there was resilience, restoration, but also change and adaptation. One colleague of mine said basically what he finds is that the Zapotec populations in this region at the time essentially voted with their feet. When inequality, when repression, when scarcity was growing in Monte Alban and Teotihuacan and these major centers, people said, well, this isn't working for me. I'm leaving. I'm going to go to a new city, a smaller city. We're going to reestablish our civilization the way we want it to be. That's a really important point, right? So Monte Alban collapses, but Zapotec, Oaxacan, early Mesoamerican civilization and society, it survived and actually thrived for long periods in these new centers. So that's a different take on collapse in the traditional picture, a different take on crisis response. The last example I'm going to talk about is, again, this period in medieval Europe, Asia, parts of North Africa, where we're calling the Black Death, right? This is the period where the bubonic plague was widespread. It's actually a longer period than people realize. The bubonic plague, it wasn't just one occurrence. It happened again and again and again over centuries. This is sort of 14th to the 19th century for a long period. I'm going to focus on Egypt during this period, especially in the 15th century. This is a time when Egypt, the country that's currently Egypt, was occupied by the Mamluk Empire. This period, I think, comes the closest of any in the past to resembling our modern polycrisis. It really had all of the hallmarks of our modern times, except that it wasn't fully global. But it had everything else, right? So first off, it was a period of really unfortunate, unstable, poor climate and environment. This was a time, we call it the Little Ice Age, really way below average temperatures for the entire Northern Hemisphere. This led to unstable ecological situations. Farming was very difficult. There was a lot of ecological disasters. Again, even though it was a period of cold rather than the period of warming that we have today, the actual ecological triggers that resulted were pretty similar to what we have today. Again, locusts were really common in East Asia and Northern Africa, major droughts in a lot of Central Asia. You can see flooding, hurricanes, tsunamis, all sorts of things. The kinds of stuff that we are facing today was happening during this long period of poor environments. This was also a period of really tightly connected, deeply entangled trade. People don't really realize this. People think of, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages as a period of isolation and regression. That wasn't really true. That was only true in like a few countries in Western Europe. In most of Eastern Europe, especially in Asia, it was actually a period of development and prosperity. A lot of trade, a lot of interaction between different countries. Egypt, in particular, was heavily involved. They exported a lot of wheat, and in turn, they had to import a lot of other goods. They were reliant on imports to feed themselves, even though they were a major producer of food as well. It was actually kind of similar to what we have today with these trade regimes. And of course, under these conditions, right? Poor environment, a lot of ecological shock, a lot of movement of people and goods between different places, a lot of inequality, right? So a lot of people were impoverished, were of poor health. This is the kind of environment where diseases thrive. So it's not a coincidence that this is when we see the bubonic plague start and really spread and devastate many areas. Again, similar to what we've seen in recent years. Because of all this, right, a very common response, there was a lot of warfare. There was disruption, there was fighting, there was violence. In particular, in the 15th century, there was a major period of warfare in sort of Central and Eastern Asia. I won't go into the details, but there was different countries were kind of fighting with each other over control of these lucrative trade routes. Egypt in particular was hit really hard by this, right? Because that fighting stopped some of the imports that Egypt relied on. It also prevented them from being able to export. And so their economy suffered. At the same time, they had a really bad bout of bubonic plague and were facing a major drought. All of these things happened at once, right? It was clearly a polycrisis kind of thing. Many, many different problems were happening at the same time. The Mamluks, who were again ruling Egypt at the time, they responded really poorly. They tried to double down on reasserting their authority. So as these things were happening, as people were suffering, as people were starving, they spent a bunch of money trying to build monuments to themselves. They were trying to, they brought in a bunch of soldiers. They tried to preserve law and order. Um, they really tried to double down on their own authority. People did not like it. There was a major civil war, huge violence. The Mamluk Sultan actually got assassinated, and this kind of ended Mamluk rule in Egypt. They went away. The Ottomans kind of took over. That doesn't matter. The point is that all of these things happened. The response didn't actually help people. It didn't relieve the suffering. And so you see a major period of violence. There's a contrast here in Northern Europe, in the Netherlands, in England. It was a little less exposed to some of this. The crises weren't quite as severe, and they had a very different response, right? There was still a lot of suffering. The plague was there. There was a lot of devastation and impoverishment and inequality. But their response was different for various reasons that it's still not fully clear exactly why. Many of the rulers in these countries said, oh, people are suffering, people are getting unruly, there's these signs of violence. Instead of trying to fight back and suppress the violence, let's change our economic systems. Let's reorganize how we do. Let's give better rights to our farmers. Let's give more protections, more rights, more inclusion into decisions to the poor populations. This was basically a complete reorganization of what we know of the feudal system in Western Europe at the time. Some historians think that this response in the 14th and 15th century, this change of the feudal contract in just a few of these countries in Northern Europe, this actually set the stage for why it was these countries that industrialized, that had the Industrial Revolution first and became the most prosperous, the most powerful countries in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was a major, major historical moment responding to these polycrisis-like events in a productive, adaptive way, in contrast to the way that many other countries like like Egypt, responded to them. So that's just a quick overview of some of the ways that we approach these historical precedents and these historical moments. So what are the lessons we can draw from this? And again, there are a few key things that have come up from our research that I want to just summarize, and we can talk about where exactly this comes from and how this works. Basically, I think that there are two key reasons why it is important to look to the past. Because history offers, first of all, examples with endings. This is what we call natural experiments, right? When you look at a period like the Black Death in Europe, we know how it played out, right? It's not just the crises, not just the risk or the disasters that happened. We also know how people responded to it, and we know how those responses played out over long periods of time. That's really important. That's something that we can't do in the present. Even looking, for example, at COVID, yeah, we know how different countries responded to COVID, but we're still feeling the outcome of that. We don't know yet how all of that is going to end up in 10, 20, 50 years. Only by looking to the past can we see how responses play out over the long period. That's really important. and you can't get that anywhere else. And also, I would say that looking to the past helps us understand the present better. We never stop being historical. Where we are today, our societies today, the problems we're facing today are very much a product of what has happened in our past. So taking this long-term view, the historical view can be just, the last 10, the last 20 years. But that itself is really important to understand how we have approached and what has brought us to where we are today. And I keep reinforcing, I do believe there are lessons from the past that can help us to understand the present and therefore navigate our future better. So just a few points to bring out from all this. First of all, even though I say that we are a product of our past, we are shaped by our past. We are not fixed by it, right? It is not set in stone. We always have options. We always have different paths that we can go on. We are directed by our past, but there's always multiple ways that we can head into the future. We have what we call a response horizon for adaptation, for transformation. For example, again, this figure is drawn from our work with the Qing dynasty that I was talking about. You can see in red here, this is basically an index of this kind of social stress that we were talking about, inequality, other factors. You can see it, it's low for the early parts of the reign, and then it starts to rise. In blue are these signs of civil violence, right? You can see them spike during these periods of ecological turmoil, but they go back down. But as the social stress starts to rise, these civil violence starts to spike higher and higher. It recovers less and less. And when social stress really takes off, then you see this major, major spike in violence. That's the Taiping Rebellion. But it didn't have to be like that. There was this response horizon during this period where you could see civil violence start to happen. You could see the signs of social stress start to rise as well, right? You have these inflection points when these turn. You can respond. You can do something differently, right? The Qing did not respond very well. They didn't adapt during the early signs when they could see corruption happening, when they could see this unrest brewing. They let it build and build and build, so it created this huge spike in violence. There was a period, there's always a period where you can respond, when you can adapt, do something differently, right? This response horizon. That's a key lesson from the past that I think we need to learn today. Another thing that is very, very common that keeps coming up in our historical research, when you talk about these stresses, these slow developing structural pressures, they amplify risk in any system. We think about them usually in environmental systems, in physical systems like bridges. Social systems are subject to the same type of social pressures, right? These create risk just like they do, just like cracks in concrete create a risk in a bridge. Cracks in your social system create risks in your society. They fracture social cohesion. They just make it harder to affect collective action. Your society can't do the things it needs to do because it's fragmented, it's polarized, it's fighting each other rather than working together to face and recover from different shocks and disasters. And because of this, when a shock does happen, it's more likely to turn into a major catastrophe because you just don't have the capacity to respond effectively. That's what social pressure does. It makes shocks more likely, and it makes you worse at responding to those shocks when they happen. It's that vicious cycle, that vicious spiral that brings you, worse and worse and worse, and creates deeper and deeper disasters. Another thing that, Guillermo mentioned this a little bit, a key of our research that we keep finding over and over again is inequality is really a key driver of this kind of societal pressure. We see this everywhere we look, every period of history, every region on Earth. And definitely it's true today as well. Inequality is a core driver, a core source of this kind of long developing social stress. And it really manifests in three different ways all at once. First off, there's the immiseration. So this is just a large segment of the population just face poverty. They face declining well-being because they just don't have enough. That's the part that everyone knows and talks about. The other side of it that I don't think people realize as much that our research tries to show is that even those who are wealthy, even those who are at the top end of the inequality spectrum, it's bad for them too. Yes, they have high living standards, they have a lot of wealth and power, absolutely. But having so much creates a lot of partisan conflict. It creates what we call elite competition. Because your life is so much better in equal societies when you are at the top, it puts so much pressure on you to be at the top and to stay at the top, to stay rich. You fight, you fight. More people are trying to gain entry. You have to compete, you have to cheat, you have to lie, you have to fight against your neighbor in order to stay in this group. It just creates a lot of conflict, which can be really divisive for a society. And while this is happening, the state itself is drained of its capacity, right? All of the wealth, all of the attention is just going to manage all of these conflicts between the social groups. The state just doesn't have anything left for if a hurricane or a flood happens, right? They just don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources. So when inequality takes root, it really messes you up on all different levels of your society. This is what we see time and time again. And again, the last lesson that we find from history is it really does matter to take this long view, right? To think of not just the moment, not just the crisis itself when it hits, but really the entire period of crisis as it builds over time. The reason this is important is because it makes a huge difference to know where the society is coming from. That determines where it heads, how it responds to a crisis, right? How is that society primed to face the different issues that happen, the different shocks and trigger events that happen in a polycrisis? Is it that these pressures, these inequalities have been building up and therefore risk is rising across many different systems? When that happens, that means that that society is primed usually for major violence and unrest, like the Qing in the lead up to the Taiping Rebellion, like medieval Egypt, when you saw this inequality happening, you saw the Mamluks not able to respond or not willing to respond appropriately and just feeding back into the unrest and the crisis. As we are seeing in many modern countries today, in the US, for example, is clearly in the situation of rising social pressure. And we are seeing it does not respond well to something like COVID, to something like economic shocks, to something like different contested elections. We are seeing a spike of violence in these countries for the same sorts of reasons. But there are other examples as well. There are positive examples where resilience and capacity is being preserved when these pressures are kept at bay. So you have the capacity to navigate your troubles or your shocks collectively. And you can install maybe even positive adaptations, right? You can build back better. We see this with the groups who were fleeing repressive rule in Monte Alban, setting up new, more equitable, preserving their culture in different settlements in the Oaxacan Valley. We see this in, for example, medieval England, when they are seeing the unrest, but responding to it by improving the lives of their poor citizens, of their farmers, and that actually set them up for a period of prosperity in later times. You can see that in many countries today that are facing environmental devastation or facing the horrors of warfare. You band together, right? Sometimes they respond with violence, sometimes they respond with compassion, sometimes they respond with collective help, collective aid, making sure families are fed, helping each other. We see these responses as well. So you get both the negative and the positive examples from history. And this brings me to the final few points I want to say. Knowing all this, understanding our historical examples, our historical precedents, thinking about where we are today in our modern polycrisis, where our societies are heading, where they're coming from. What is the role of youth in our current moment, current moment? Youth are very important, right? You guys, the youth, you're the ones who are inheriting these systems, who are inheriting the history, but you are also going to be here and responsible for where we take it in the future. You are the nexus that links our past to our future. That is absolutely critical. It is not fair, it is not easy, but it is the most important job that we have today. And there are some different things, again, that we learn from history, some ideas that come through that are sort of cornerstones for how youth can respond in these sorts of periods. Again, taking the long-term view, thinking historically, thinking about where have we come from, while also being sure to take care of the immediate needs. And that's really difficult, to have the long term. What can we do about the big social stresses that are building up? But also needing to respond to the immediate acute shocks and triggers. Balancing those two things is a challenge. Again, knowing what to keep and what to get rid of. Preserving what matters, preserving what has worked before. We don't want to get rid of everything. We have a lot of systems of culture, of community, of support. We want those things to stay, right? Just like in Monte Alban. They brought with them the most important parts of their culture. We want to do that as well, while at the same time, not being afraid of radical change for our systems that aren't working. Maybe it's some of our economic systems, the way we work economically. Maybe it's some of our political institutions. We see this as well with medieval England. They weren't afraid to completely reorganize their political economy. And it worked out. What to keep, what to change? That's a big question we all have to ask ourselves. And again, radical change is not good in and of itself. There is a theory, a group of people who think that any change, you have to sort of burn it all down to build it up. That's not true. You want to preserve what's good, and change itself isn't good. It's only change when it really increases the prosperity, increases the well-being and protections of everybody, not just increasing economic growth or increasing the profits for a few, right? You have to be very targeted with your change. In order to do this, we need to think collectively, right? Not just one group of people, not just one set of businesses, not just one class. Everybody. It has to be everybody, otherwise it does not work. And history shows this time and again. If you're not taking care of everybody, you're taking care of nobody. And we have to confront our conflicts with empathy and compassion, right? When we see unrest, when we see people who disagree with us, our immediate response is often to meet them with violence, to clamp down. We see, like with the Mamluks in Egypt, with the Qing as they're facing social unrest, that does not work. Violence begets more violence. You have to meet unrest, you have to meet violence with compassion, with empathy, with understanding, with consilience. That's the only way to build forward collectively and peacefully. And so this is really the challenge. This is not easy. I don't know how to do this, but this is the challenge before you as youth in a polycrisis moment. It's learning how to imagine new social systems, being able to confront the status quo. What are the systems? What are the patterns we have? How can we change them in spite of and in opposition to the people who want to preserve the status quo because they are benefiting from them? And how can we then take the patterns we have and re-pattern, establish new patterns, new ways of living? I have a colleague in the Repatterning Collective. This is what we are trying to do, is understand and develop processes to change our patterns in response to this polycrisis. And this is really, again, what we find and what we do at SODI is putting all of these perspectives together, understanding that our past is prologue to our future. It sets the stage. History sets the stage for where we are and where we're going, but it does not have to repeat itself, right? It rhymes It sounds similar. We are facing many similar crises as we have in the past, but there are still multiple different paths before us. We can either keep building up this pressure, keep raising our fragility and our risks, or we can start to build up our resilience and our adaptability to navigate this polycrisis better collectively. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you all of the people who support this work. I'm very, very happy to listen to any questions and comments that you all have. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen now.